My father laughed and said, "Who would want you?" And in that instant, as his mocking voice echoed across the dimly lit dining room, place that once smelled of warmth and bread, fresh from my mother's hands, but now reeked only of bitterness and cigarette smoke, something inside me cracked with the sharpness of glass, splintering underfoot. A fissure that ran deep into my chest, reminding me that for years I had been the silent sacrifice, the overlooked daughter, the fragile scapegoat on whom his frustrations landed like heavy stones, and yet he had no idea about my secret love. The only thing that kept me breathing when nights turned suffocating and mornings offered no comfort, a love hidden like a glowing ember beneath ashes, waiting for the day when it would ignite into a fire that could consume every cruel word he had thrown at me, and I remember staring at him. My lips pressed tightly shut so that no sound of protest escaped, because I had learned long ago that defending myself only earned harsher punishments, words sharpened into knives, and yet my silence that night was not the silence of defeat, but of plotting. The kind of silence in which memories of pain harden into resolve, and while his laughter faded and the clinking of his glass against the table filled the room, I was thinking of him, the one I loved in secret, the one whose eyes had once locked onto mine with a promise unspoken but strong enough to stitch together the tatters of my soul. And though my father thought me worthless, unwanted, destined for a life of invisibility, he could not see the threads of destiny weaving beneath his very nose. Because love, even when hidden, even when unacknowledged, grows like wild ivy in the dark, wrapping itself around the heart until it becomes impossible to tear away. And as the days passed after that cruel evening, I carried his words with me not as wounds but as fuel, telling myself that one day he would choke on the very laughter that dismissed me, because what he thought was weakness in me was only the quiet patience of someone waiting for her moment. And I knew the family I belonged to, the revenge family, as neighbors whispered when scandals spread through town, was no ordinary family. Its history steeped in betrayals, debts of blood, and grudges passed like heirlooms from parent to child, each generation adding another stone to the mountain of resentment. And though my father pretended to stand at its peak as a man of authority, he was in truth just another flawed heir to that poisonous legacy, blind to the fact that his cruelty would breed within me the fiercest form of vengeance, one tempered not in hatred alone, but in the delicate steel of forbidden love. And each time I sneaked away to meet him, the man who was both my solace and my secret, I felt as though I was defying every expectation that bound me, every chain my father tried to wrap around my existence, for in those stolen moments of tenderness beneath the weeping willow by the river, where moonlight scattered like broken glass across the water, I discovered what it meant to be wanted, to be seen, to be cherished in a way my own blood had denied me. And the knowledge of it burned so brightly that I began to wonder if perhaps revenge was not only about striking back with equal cruelty, but also about living fully, shamelessly, in spite of those who tried to break me, though deep down I knew the story was far from that simple. Because in our family, love never came without cost, secrets never stayed buried, and every smile hid a blade waiting to be drawn. And so as my father's laughter haunted me, and my mother's silence pressed on me like a suffocating shroud, she too a prisoner of his words, I felt myself transforming, day by day, from the unwanted daughter into the keeper of a secret powerful enough to change everything. Because when he would finally discover who held my heart, the very foundation of his pride, his wealth, his alliances would begin to crumble. And it was in that vision of the future, painted in equal strokes of pain and triumph, that I found the strength to endure, to wait, to love in silence until the time came when silence would no longer be necessary, when revenge, sharp and merciless, would finally bloom. Secondly, gloom. The days that followed my father's cruel remark unfolded like a shadowed tapestry, each thread woven with a mixture of silence, suppressed anger, and the intoxicating thrill of my hidden love. And though outwardly I remained the dutiful daughter, keeping my head bowed and my voice hushed whenever he barked his orders or dismissed me with that cold laugh, within me something was shifting, like an underground river changing its course, preparing to burst through stone, and I found myself clinging to every glance, every whispered word, every stolen moment with him my secret, as though he were not only the one who loved me, but also the compass pointing me toward the life I longed for, a life beyond the suffocating walls of my family's estate. A life where love was not measured in alliances or dowries or blood debts, but in the simple act of being chosen, wanted, cherished, and each time his hand brushed against mine, hidden in the darkness of our clandestine meetings, I felt the power of that choice. A validation so profound that it made my father's words seem almost laughable. For if only he knew, if only he realized that someone saw me not as unwanted but as irreplaceable, he would understand that his attempt to belittle me had failed. Yet I knew better than to underestimate him. For my father was not merely a cruel man, but a strategist, a patriarch bred in the marrow of revenge, raised on the belief that weakness in the family line must be cut away like rot before it spread. And though he dismissed me now, I could not escape the certainty that one day, when my secret was revealed, he would not sit idle, and it was that certainty that kept me cautious, forcing me to hide my love as though it were a crime punishable by exile, or worse, by blood. And in our family, blood was never spared lightly, for stories whispered by uncles, cousins, and even the servants told of betrayals avenged decades later, of sisters married off as pawns and brothers strangled in their sleep for daring to love across enemy lines. And I often wondered if my father's cruelty toward me was rooted not in disdain alone, but in fear that like so many before me, would one day disrupt the careful balance of power he tried so desperately to maintain. But what he could not see was that the disruption had already begun, quietly, in my heart, in my body, in the way I began to walk with a hidden fire despite his insults. The way my eyes no longer lowered out of shame but out of calculation. And I began to study him, my father, watching the way he shifted alliances, the way he smiled too broadly at his rivals, the way his hand lingered on the ledger book where secrets of debts and favors were kept. And I realized that revenge was not a moment of rage, but a slow harvest, requiring patience, cunning, and timing, and in this realization, I felt an unexpected kinship with him, though twisted because I was becoming what he had always valued: strategic, observant, unyielding, yet in my own way. Reshaped by love rather than fear, and as months passed, the tension between us grew thicker, unspoken but heavy, for he must have sensed something in me, though he could not name it, a defiance coiled and waiting, and my mother, ever silent, ever shadowed, began to glance at me with eyes that held both warning and sorrow, as though she recognized the path I was walking, knew it could only end in fire, and yet she said nothing. Perhaps because she herself had been silenced long ago. Her own loves and desires crushed under the weight of a family that valued revenge above tenderness. But I refused to be like her. I refused to let myself wither into nothingness. And so every night I met him. Every night I pressed my secrets into the darkness and let love fortify me for the battles I knew would come. Because it was no longer just about surviving my father's cruelty. It was about proving him wrong. About showing him that the daughter he thought unworthy was capable of carrying both love and vengeance in her hands, and that one day he would kneel beneath the weight of what he had dismissed. But until then, I would wait, I would watch, I would let the storm inside me grow until it was unstoppable, and in that quiet, unending preparation, I began to understand that this was the true inheritance of the revenge family. Not just the grudges and the punishments, not just the blood debts and the feuds, but the ability to transform pain into power, to transform dismissal into determination, and with every cruel laugh he gave me. With every look of disdain, he was unknowingly sharpening the blade I would one day use, a blade forged not of steel but of truth, love, and an unbreakable will. There came a time when the air within the house grew heavy with suspicion, as though my father's mocking words had seeded in him a curiosity he could not ignore, as if he were trying to solve a puzzle whose answer had been mocking him all along. And though I tried to remain as silent and invisible as ever, there was no hiding the way love transforms a person, the way it softens the face yet steals the gaze. The way it makes even a caged bird sing louder within its heart, and I could feel myself betraying the very secret I had vowed to protect, for my steps grew lighter after every meeting with him. My voice carried a confidence I had never known, and even in moments of my father's cruelty, I felt a strength that should have frightened him, but instead seemed to intrigue him. And so he began to question me, at first in subtle ways, asking where I spent my evenings, commenting on the faint smell of river reeds in my hair, probing with words dipped in casualness but sharpened by intent. And I, knowing the danger, learned to weave lies that sounded like truth, for deception had become as necessary to me as breath, and still I could not stay away from my secret love, could not deny the way his presence healed the wounds my father inflicted daily, and we grew reckless, meeting not only beneath the willow, but in abandoned corridors of the family estate, in forgotten gardens overrun with ivy, in places where shadows were our only allies, and each kiss stolen there carried the risk of discovery. Each whispered promise felt like a declaration against the iron chains of my family's expectations, and it was in one such hidden embrace that he told me he would not let them dictate our fate, that he would fight for me, that even if the truth tore the family apart, he would stand with me. And though fear licked at my bones, I believed him, because his love was the only truth I had ever known, stronger than my father's cruelty, brighter than my mother's silence, fiercer than the legacy of revenge that had shackled us all for generations. Yet love, I realized, is never enough to shield one from the storm of family honor. And soon enough whispers reached me through cousins and servants that my father had begun sending men to follow me, to trace my steps, to uncover the shadow that had changed his unwanted daughter into something he could no longer control. And I knew then that discovery was no longer a distant threat but an inevitability. And yet I did not stop, for to stop would be to betray not only him but myself, to surrender before the fight had even begun. And so I continued, reckless with love, brave with defiance, even as the noose of my father's suspicion tightened around me, and in the nights when I lay awake listening to the silence of the house, broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, I could almost hear the murmurs of my ancestors, their stories of vengeance woven into my blood, urging me to choose my path carefully, to wield my love as both shield and sword. And I realized that the secret I held was no longer just mine. It was a spark waiting to ignite centuries of bitterness, a spark that could either free me or destroy me. And in the mirror I began to see not the girl my father mocked, but the woman he would one day fear, a woman who carried both the tenderness of forbidden love and the ruthlessness of a family that had survived on revenge. And though the outcome was uncertain, though I knew the cost could be devastating, I also knew there was no turning back, because once a heart tastes true love, it cannot return to the silence of neglect, and once a soul begins to hunger for justice, it cannot go on feeding only on patience. And so I braced myself, not for the possibility of discovery, but for the certainty of war within my own home, a war between love and blood, between inheritance and desire, and in that war I vowed I would not be the one to fall, for my father had underestimated me for the last time, and I would show him that the daughter he deemed unwanted was the very storm he had feared all his life, the storm born of love, silence, and vengeance waiting to strike. The day my father confronted me for the first time about my absences is carved into my memory like a scar that refuses to fade, for it was not with shouting or violence that he came at me, but with the icy calm of a man who had learned long ago that control lay not in loudness, but in precision. And he sat across from me at the long oak table, the very table at which generations of our family had plotted schemes and sworn oaths, his fingers tapping slowly as his eyes burned holes into me, and he asked almost lazily, almost mockingly, "Tell me, daughter, what keeps you from this house so late at night?" And though his voice was smooth, I could feel the sharpened teeth hidden beneath, the threat coiled in every syllable. Yet I met his gaze without flinching, for the love I carried within me had given me a courage I had never known, and I lied, smoothly, telling him I had found comfort in walking by the river, that the water calmed me when his words, his world grew too loud, and though a flicker of suspicion crossed his face, he said nothing, only leaned back in his chair and gave that same laugh, low and cruel. The laugh that had once broken me, but now only steeled my resolve, and I knew then that he was not convinced, that the walls around me were closing in. And yet, instead of fear, I felt a strange exhilaration, because his suspicion meant that I mattered, that I was no longer invisible to him, that the daughter he had dismissed as unwanted now occupied his mind like an unsolved riddle. And perhaps that was the beginning of my revenge, not the grand revelation I had dreamed of, but this small shift, this turning of his gaze toward me. forced by the power of the love he knew nothing about. And it was after that confrontation that my mother came to me in the quiet of night, her steps hesitant, her hands trembling as though she were about to commit a crime. And she whispered, "He knows," her eyes wide with the kind of fear I had only ever seen in cornered animals. Then I realized that she had been watching me all along, that her silence had not been ignorance but complicity, a form of protection she had tried to offer by looking away. And in that moment I felt both anger and tenderness toward her, anger that she had never fought for me, never spoken against him, but tenderness too, because perhaps silence was the only weapon she had ever been allowed, and when she took my hand and begged me to end whatever it was that kept me sneaking away, I shook my head, for how could I end the only thing that had ever given me life? And though tears filled her eyes, she said no more, retreating back into her shadows, leaving me alone with my choice. And I understood then that love had placed me on a path I could not leave, even if I wanted to. A path that led not only to freedom, but to inevitable conflict. And as days turned into weeks, the tension in the house grew unbearable, every conversation laced with suspicion, every silence heavier than stone, and my father began testing me with questions designed to corner me. Yet each time I slipped through his traps with lies that tasted like poison on my tongue, and though I hated deceiving, I reminded myself that lies were the only shield I had until the time came when truth could be wielded as a weapon. And in secret my love and I began to speak not only of our hearts but of escape, of building a world beyond the reach of my father's cruelty. And yet I could not help but feel the tug of my blood, the pull of that ancestral legacy of revenge, whispering to me that running was not enough. That true freedom would come only when my father's hold was broken, shattered, ground to dust, and in the quietest corners of my mind I began to plan. Not recklessly, not in haste, but with the patience my bloodline demanded, imagining the day when his mocking words would return to him like a curse. When the man who asked who would want you would be forced to see that I was wanted beyond measure, loved beyond, fear stronger than he had ever believed. And though doubt sometimes crept in, though I wondered if love and vengeance could coexist without destroying one another, each kiss from him reminded me that I was no longer the fragile girl my father had dismissed. I was a woman forged in fire, carrying within me both tenderness and wrath, and I would not break, not now, not ever, no matter what storm was about to come crashing through the walls of our family. It was in the weeks that followed my mother's whispered warning that I began to notice how carefully my father moved around me, no longer dismissing me as background noise, but circling me like a predator waiting for its prey to stumble, and his questions grew sharper, his glances heavier. His patience thinner, and though he still laughed at me, the laughter had changed. No longer casual mockery, but the brittle edge of a man who senses he is losing control of a game he did not even realize had begun. And in that brittle laughter, I found my strength, my strength. Or the fear that once silenced me now burned into determination. And I promised myself that if I was indeed prey, then I would also be the hunter, learning his patterns, memorizing the rise and fall of his temper, watching how he clutched the family ledger like a lifeline. And I knew that ledger was more than numbers, that within its pages were secrets, debts, betrayals, perhaps even the very foundation of his power, and I longed to uncover it, to turn his own weapons against him, yet my love pulled me in the opposite direction, urging me to run, to leave the house and its poisons behind, to build a life of simplicity and peace, and in his arms I felt the temptation of that freedom, the dream of mornings unburdened by suspicion and nights filled only with tenderness, but as much as I wanted it, I could not escape the pull of my blood. The anchor of vengeance dragging at my feet, for to walk away without a fight felt like surrender, felt like leaving my younger self, the girl who had endured his cruelty, who had been told she was unwanted, abandoned in the shadows, and I could not betray her like that. I could not betray myself. And so I lived between two worlds, one of secret love and one of secret vengeance, each fueling the other, until they became inseparable. For was not love itself an act of revenge against a father who insisted no one would ever want me? And was not revenge a way of protecting the love he would try to destroy? And as these thoughts tangled inside me, I began to act with greater boldness, meeting my love not only in the hidden corners of the estate, but daring to linger near the village square, daring to walk where others might see. because part of me wanted discovery, wanted the truth to explode and shatter the silence. Yet at the same time, I trembled at the cost, knowing my father would not let such defiance go unpunished. And indeed, one night as I crept back through the garden, I caught sight of shadows moving where no shadows should be. Men my father trusted lurking among the hedges, and I knew then that he had set his eyes fully upon me, that my time was running short, and though fear gripped me, I held on to the image of my love's face. The way his eyes refused to doubt me, and I told myself that even if the world collapsed around us, we had already won something my father could never take. That I was wanted, cherished, chosen, and yet the whispers of the past, the weight of our family's legacy, pressed harder each day, reminding me that in our house no secret remained hidden forever, and when it was uncovered, the consequences were always soaked in blood. And so I began to prepare, not only for escape but for confrontation, gathering scraps of knowledge, testing the locks on his study door, memorizing the routes of the guards he placed in the garden, sharpening my mind the way one sharpens a blade, because I knew that the storm was coming. And when it broke, love and revenge would collide so violently that nothing in our family would ever be the same again.